Detective Sarah Martinez gripped the radio clipped to her bulletproof vest as dispatch crackled through the static. Unit 47, domestic disturbance at Riverside Apartments, Building C, Apartment 4B. Multiple complaints from neighbors reporting screaming and possible drug activity. Proceed with caution. The October afternoon sun cast long shadows across the crumbling concrete of Phoenix's east side as Martinez pulled her patrol car into the pothole-riddled parking lot. The Riverside Apartments had seen better days probably 30 years ago. Paint peeled from the exterior walls like sunburned skin, and half the security lights hung broken or missing entirely. This wasn't her first call to this complex, and it wouldn't be her last. "Come on, Rex," she called to her canine partner, a 4-year-old German shepherd, whose dark eyes held the intelligence of a seasoned detective. Rex had been her partner for 2 years now, trained in narcotics detection and suspect apprehension. But what Martinez valued most was his uncanny ability to sense danger before she did. As they climbed the external staircase to the second floor, the smell hit them, a nauseating cocktail of stale cigarettes, rotting food, and something chemical that made Rex's ears perk forward in alert. Martinez had smelled it too many times before. Meth labs had their own distinct odor, acrid and medicinal, like cleaning supplies mixed with burnt plastic. She knocked firmly on the door of 4B, Phoenix Police Department. Opened the door. Silence. Martinez pressed her ear to the thin wood. No movement, no voices, but something felt wrong. The apartment was too quiet for a domestic disturbance call, especially one that had prompted 3 different neighbors to dial 911 within the past hour. "Sir, we need to speak with you." "This is the police." Still nothing. Rex whined softly and pawed at the base of the door, his tail rigid with tension. Martinez had learned to trust her partner's instincts completely. If Rex sensed something was wrong, something was definitely wrong. She tried the handle. Locked, but the door felt flimsy against her shoulder. Martinez made the decision that would change 3 lives forever. "Phoenix Police, coming in." The door splintered on the second kick, swinging open to reveal a scene that would haunt her dreams for months to come. The apartment was a disaster zone, furniture overturned, glass scattered across the linoleum floor, and drug paraphernalia spread across every surface like some twisted board game. Empty beer bottles formed a small mountain beside a stained couch where a thin man in his 30s lay unconscious, a needle still dangling from his collapsed vein. But it wasn't the drugs or the mess that made Martinez's breath catch in her throat. It was the tiny pair of bare feet she glimpsed beneath the kitchen table, small, dirty, and absolutely motionless. "Jesus Christ," she whispered, holstering her weapon and dropping to her knees. "Rex, stay back." Under the table, pressed against the far wall like a cornered animal, sat the smallest child Martinez had ever encountered on a call. The little girl couldn't have been more than 3 years old, with tangled blonde hair that hung in greasy strands around a face streaked with tears and dirt. She wore a pink pajama top that had once featured cartoon characters, but was now stained with substances Martinez didn't want to identify, and a diaper that clearly hadn't been changed in days. In her tiny arms, she clutched a stuffed bunny that had seen better decades. One of its ears was missing, the other hung by a few threads, and the once white fur had turned a sickly gray. But she held it like it was her lifeline to sanity in a world that had gone completely mad. "Hi there, sweetheart," Martinez said softly, making herself as small as possible as she crouched beside the table. "My name is Sarah. I'm a police officer, and I'm here to help you." The child's enormous blue eyes stared back at her with a look that no 3-year-old should ever possess, the hollow, ancient gaze of someone who had seen too much, endured too much, survived too much. She didn't speak, didn't move, just watched. Martinez, with the wariness of a wild animal, evaluating a potential threat. Rex, sensing the delicate nature of the situation, lowered himself to the floor about 6 feet away and began to crawl forward on his belly, moving with the patience of a hunter, but the gentleness of a therapy dog. His training had prepared him for many scenarios, but nothing had prepared him for this moment, when his protective instincts would be tested by the most vulnerable victim he'd ever encountered. "That's Rex," Martinez explained, keeping her voice barely above a whisper. "He's a very good boy, and he's here to help too. Rex loves children. Would you like to meet him?" The little girl's eyes shifted to the German Shepherd, and for the first time since Martinez had broken down the door, she saw a flicker of something other than terror in the child's expression. Curiosity, maybe even hope. Rex continued his careful approach until he was close enough for the girl to touch him if she wanted. Then he did something that would become legendary in the Phoenix Police Department. He placed his massive head on his paws and whimpered, a soft, plaintive sound that seemed to say, "I understand your pain, little one. You're safe now." The child's grip on her raggedy bunny loosened slightly. Her cracked lips moved almost imperceptibly, and Martinez had to strain to hear the words that would echo in her memory forever. "Nice doggy won't hurt Emma?" It was a question that broke Martinez's heart and filled it with hope simultaneously. This tiny survivor had found the courage to speak, to trust, to believe that maybe, just maybe, her nightmare was finally over. "No, sweetheart," Martinez whispered back, tears she couldn't control streaming down her cheeks. "Rex would never hurt Emma, and neither would I. We're here to keep you safe." As sirens wailed in the distance and backup units flooded the parking lot below, Detective Sarah Martinez knew she was witnessing the beginning of a story that would test every assumption she'd ever made about justice, family, and the resilience of the human spirit. Emma was safe now, but her journey was just beginning. The emergency medical technician's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he checked Mark Wilson's vitals in the back of the ambulance. His pulse was weak but steady, pupils dilated to pinpoint classic signs of heroin overdose. "He'll live." The EMT called out to Detective Martinez, but he was maybe 20 minutes away from not making it. Kid probably saved his life by hiding under that table and staying quiet. Martinez watched the ambulance disappear into Phoenix traffic, its red and blue lights painting the apartment complex in alternating waves of color. The irony wasn't lost on her. Emma's terror had likely prevented her from calling for help, but that same paralysis had kept her from disturbing her father's potentially fatal high. "Detective Martinez?" A voice behind her belonged to Janet Reeves, a veteran social worker from Child Protective Services who'd arrived within minutes of the call. Janet had the weathered look of someone who'd seen humanity at its worst, but somehow maintained faith in its capacity for redemption. "I need to interview the child, but she won't come out from under the table." They returned to apartment 4B, where Emma remained exactly where they'd found her. Crime scene techs worked around the small kitchen table like it was a sacred shrine, photographing evidence while giving the traumatized child as much space as possible. Rex had positioned himself as a barrier between Emma and the chaos, his brown eyes never leaving her face. "Emma, sweetie," Janet said, crouching beside Martinez. "My name is Miss Janet. I help children who need safe places to stay. Would you like to come with me?" Emma's response was to burrow deeper under the table, pressing herself against the wall until she seemed to almost disappear. The only sound was her ragged breathing and the soft whimper she made when camera flashes lit up the apartment. "She's been alone for 3 days, Martinez said quietly, piecing together the timeline from witness statements. Neighbors heard screaming Thursday night. That would be the mother leaving. Father's been unconscious since Friday, maybe Saturday. It's Sunday now. The implications hit Janet like a physical blow. This baby had survived 3 days in a drug house with an unconscious addict, subsisting on whatever scraps she could find. Too young to understand why her world had collapsed, but old enough to know she needed to hide. What about the mother? Janet asked. Martinez consulted her notes. Lisa Marie Wilson, age 26, waitress at Denny's on McDowell Road. Neighbors describe her as nice but scared. Apparently, she and Mark had been fighting more frequently. Thursday night, Mrs. Patterson next door heard what sounded like furniture being thrown. Lisa screaming, "I can't do this anymore," and then a door slamming. Lisa's car was gone by midnight. Abandoned her child to save herself, Janet muttered. But Martinez held up a hand. Maybe. Or maybe she was running for her life and planned to come back. Mrs. Patterson also mentioned seeing Lisa's beat-up Honda Civic in the parking lot twice since Thursday, once Friday morning, once Saturday evening. Said it looked like she was sitting in the car crying, but she never came upstairs. The complexity of the situation was becoming clearer. This wasn't a simple case of parental abandonment. It was a tragic collision of addiction, domestic violence, poverty, and impossible choices. Lisa Wilson might be a victim or an accomplice, or both, depending on which lens you use to examine her actions. Crime scene photographer Tommy Chan approached them carefully. "Detective, you need to see this." He led them to Emma's makeshift survival station. Behind a fallen chair, she'd created a small nest using couch cushions and dirty laundry. Scattered around were empty cracker boxes, an overturned sippy cup that still held traces of water, and several drawings made with crayons on the backs of unpaid bills. "She drew these," Tommy said, holding up the childish artwork. The drawings were mostly scribbles in brown and black, but one stood out, a large four-legged figure in brown crayon with pointy ears and a long tail. Underneath, in the unsteady letters of a preschooler, someone had helped her write Rex. "She drew this after we arrived," Martinez realized. "Look at the timestamp on your photos. This wasn't here when we first came in." Janet studied the drawing with professional interest. Children this age process trauma through play and art. She's already formed an attachment to your canine partner. That's actually a very positive sign for her recovery. As if summoned by their conversation, Emma's small voice drifted from under the table. "Where'd Rex go?" The three adults exchanged glances. In the past hour, Emma had spoken exactly 4 words. To Rex, and now 2 words about him. She'd shown no interest in the paramedics, social workers, or crime scene investigators, but the absence of a police dog had prompted her first direct communication with another human being. "Rex is right here, sweetie," Martinez said, signaling her partner to move closer. "He's been waiting for you." Rex approached the table with the same careful deliberation he'd shown earlier. This time, Emma extended one tiny hand from her hiding place, her fingers barely brushing the tip of his nose, before quickly withdrawing. "She's going to need extensive therapy," Janet said quietly. "The trauma indicators are severe selective mutism, regressive behavior, hypervigilance. But the fact that she's responding to the dog." She trailed off, an idea forming. "What are you thinking?" Martinez asked. "There are programs that use therapy animals to help children recover from trauma. If she's formed this kind of bond with Rex, maybe we can work with that." Martinez felt a protective surge toward both Emma and her partner. Rex isn't trained as a therapy dog. He's narcotics detection and apprehension. But he's responding to her like a therapy dog, Janet pointed out. "Look at his body language. He's being gentler with her than most certified therapy animals I've worked with." As they spoke, Emma had crept forward enough that half her face was visible. She was watching Rex with intense concentration, as if trying to memorize every detail of his appearance. When he lowered his head to her eye level, she whispered something so softly that only he could hear it. Whatever she said made Rex's tail move in the slightest wag, not the enthusiastic display of a happy dog, but the careful response of a professional who understood he was working with someone very fragile. "We need to get her out of here," Janet said finally. "I've got a foster family that's experienced with trauma cases, the Rodriguez family. They've got 2 grown children and have fostered 12 kids over the past decade." As Janet made arrangements and crime scene techs finished their work, Detective Martinez found herself making a decision that would change the trajectory of her career. She knelt beside Emma one more time. "Emma, you're going to go with Miss Janet to a safe house with a nice family. But I want you to know something, Rex, and I work for the police department. And part of our job is making sure little girls like you stay safe. We're going to check on you, okay?" Emma's response was to clutch her damaged bunny tighter and nod once. The first clear communication she'd made to anyone other than Rex. 3 lives had intersected in tragedy. But as the sun set over Phoenix, Detective Martinez had the strangest feeling that this was just the beginning of their story together. 6 months had transformed the Maricopa County Prosecutor's Office into a battlefield of legal precedents and moral complexities. James Chun sat in his corner office on the 14th floor, surrounded by towers of case files, legal briefs, and expert witness reports that seemed to grow taller each day. Outside his window, the Phoenix skyline shimmered in the desert heat, but his attention was focused entirely on the most challenging case of his 15-year career. The Wilson family case had everything that made prosecutors lose sleep. A 3-year-old victim too young to understand legal proceedings, parents whose guilt existed on a spectrum of gray rather than black and white, and a media circus that had turned a tragic family situation into a public referendum on addiction, poverty, and child welfare. "Tell me again why we're not just accepting the plea deals," Chan said to his assistant district attorney, Maria Santos, who sat across from his desk reviewing psychiatric evaluations. "Because Emma deserves justice," Maria replied without looking up. Mark Wilson ran a drug operation out of his home while caring for a toddler. Lisa Wilson abandoned her child for 3 days with an unconscious addict. The fact that they're both claiming to be victims doesn't erase what Emma went through. Sean nodded, but the weight of the decision pressed on his shoulders like a physical burden. Mark Wilson had been clean for 4 months now, attending NI meetings daily and working with a therapist who specialized in addiction recovery. His transformation appeared genuine. Gone was the skeletal junkie from the arrest photos, replaced by a man who'd gained 30 pounds and spoke with clear-eyed determination about rebuilding his life. But appearances could be deceiving, especially when prison time hung in the balance. Lisa Wilson's case was even more complicated. Her defense attorney, Michael Torres, had built a compelling narrative of domestic abuse, economic desperation, and impossible choices. Lisa had been working 60-hour weeks at minimum wage to support Mark's habit, enduring escalating violence while trying to protect Emma. The night she left, hospital records showed she'd been treated for a broken rib and facial contusions injuries she'd initially claimed were from falling downstairs. "Dr. Foster's report came in this morning," Maria said, sliding a thick manila folder across Chun's desk. "Emma's making progress, but she's still exhibiting severe trauma responses. She won't speak to anyone except the Rodriguez family and occasionally Detective Martinez. And she has recurring nightmares about the bad place and Daddy sleeping forever." Chun opened the psychological evaluation, scanning Dr. Amanda Foster's carefully worded assessment. Emma had been living with Carlos and Elena Rodriguez for 6 months now, and their patients had worked small miracles. The couple, both retired teachers in their 50s, had fostered 12 children over the past decade and specialized in cases involving severe trauma. Their own children were grown and lived nearby, providing Emma with older siblings who visited regularly and treated her like family. But despite the Rodriguez family's love and Dr. Foster's expertise, Emma remained fragile. She spoke in whispers when she spoke at all, required nightlights in every room, and became hysterical if separated from a small group of trusted adults for more than a few minutes. The idea of putting her on a witness stand, even in closed session, had initially seemed impossible. "What changed your mind about her testimony?" Maria asked, noting Chun's shift from skeptical prosecutor to advocate for Emma's voice. Chun turned to the section of Dr. Foster's report that had kept him awake for the past 3 nights. "Listen to this. Subject continues to demonstrate selective trust patterns, with strongest attachment responses reserved for Detective Martinez's canine partner, Rex. During supervised visits to the police station, Emma's anxiety levels decrease significantly, speech patterns normalize, and she displays age-appropriate behavior. She has drawn 47 pictures of Rex over the past 6 months and keeps a photograph of the dog beside her bed." When asked about traumatic events, Emma consistently redirects conversation toward Rex, suggesting the animal serves as both emotional anchor and communication facilitator. The implications were staggering. Emma wouldn't talk to lawyers, judges, or even her own parents about what had happened in apartment 4B, but she would spend hours telling Rex about her experiences with the innocent honesty of a 3-year-old who didn't understand the legal weight of her words. Torres had already filed motions challenging Emma's competency as a witness, arguing that testimony from a child her age was inherently unreliable and potentially traumatic. His legal briefs cited dozens of cases where children's testimony had been excluded due to age-related limitations in memory, comprehension, and susceptibility to suggestion. But Chun had found equally compelling precedents supporting child testimony when proper safeguards were implemented. The breakthrough had come during Emma's monthly supervised visit with her father at the county jail. Mark Wilson had been clean long enough for the fog of addiction to lift completely, and seeing Emma after months of separation had triggered a breakdown that surprised everyone, including his own defense attorney. "I don't want custody," Mark had sobbed to his lawyer after the visit, which Emma had spent hiding behind Detective Martinez and whispering to Rex about the scary place where Daddy lives now. "I want her safe. I want her happy. I want her to forget she ever had a father who put drugs before her well-being." Lisa's response had been more complicated. She desperately wanted her daughter back, had completed parenting classes and domestic violence counseling, and was working 2 jobs to prove her stability. But Emma's reaction to seeing her mother had been even more distressing than her response to Mark. The little girl had seemed to recognize Lisa, but had become catatonic during the visit, staring blankly while her mother cried and pleaded for forgiveness. Dr. Foster had explained the psychological dynamics. Emma associated her father with danger, but also with consistency. Even a drugged Mark had been a predictable presence in her life. Lisa represented abandonment, the terrifying moment when Emma's world had collapsed, and the person who was supposed to protect her had simply vanished. Judge Patricia Holbrook had agreed to review Dr. Foster's recommendation for allowing Rex in the courtroom, but the precedent was unprecedented in Arizona family court. Therapy animals were sometimes permitted in cases involving adult trauma victims, but never in testimony involving someone Emma's age. "The defense will argue it's prejudicial," Maria warned. "A cute police dog sitting next to a traumatized child? The jury will convict both parents before we present our first piece of evidence." Chun understood the concern, but he also understood something else. Emma Wilson had survived 3 days in hell by hiding under a kitchen table, and the only creature on earth who could coax her out was a German shepherd trained to detect drugs and apprehend criminals. If Rex could help Emma find her voice, then the legal system needed to find a way to accommodate that reality. "Schedule a hearing with Judge Holbrook," Chun said finally. "We're going to argue for accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Emma's trauma has created a communication disability, and Rex is essentially her assistive device." It was a legal long shot, but then again, everything about Emma Wilson's case had been unprecedented from the moment Detective Martinez kicked down apartment 4B's door. Sometimes justice required credulity, courage, and faith that the system could adapt to protect its most vulnerable victims. Outside, the Phoenix sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of hope and determination. The leak happened on a Tuesday morning, and by Wednesday evening, Emma Wilson's story had exploded across every major news network in America. Channel 12 News broke the story first with a sensational headline: 3-year-old drug house survivor may testify with police dog in unprecedented court case. Within hours, the story had been picked up by CNN, Fox News, and every major newspaper from coast to coast. Detective Martinez discovered the media frenzy when her phone started buzzing. At 5:47 a.m. with calls from reporters, producers, and talk show bookers. By the time she arrived at the Phoenix Police Department, a small army of news vans had set up camp in the parking lot. Their satellite dishes pointed skyward like metallic flowers reaching for the sun. "This is a nightmare," Captain Rodriguez told Martinez as they watched the circus unfold from his office window. Channel 5 just ran a piece calling Emma America's bravest baby. Channel 15 is doing an expose on drug addiction and child endangerment. And some blogger from California is already selling t-shirts with Rex's picture and the slogan, "Justice has 4 paws." The media attention brought unexpected allies and enemies. Dr. Rebecca Morrison, a renowned child psychologist from Stanford, flew to Phoenix at her own expense to offer expert testimony supporting Emma's right to testify with Rex. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children issued a statement calling the case a groundbreaking opportunity to give voice to America's most vulnerable victims. But the opposition was equally vocal. Legal scholars questioned whether allowing a therapy animal during testimony would set a dangerous precedent that could be manipulated by future defendants. The American Civil Liberties Union filed an amicus brief arguing that the presence of a police dog might intimidate or influence potential jurors, violating the defendant's right to a fair trial. Meanwhile, Mark Wilson was experiencing his own transformation behind bars. The Maricopa County Jail's addiction recovery program had become his lifeline, and he'd emerged as one of their most successful participants. His counselor, Dr. Janet Williams, described his progress as remarkable in a report that would later become crucial evidence. Mark has confronted the full reality of his addiction and its impact on his daughter. Dr. Williams wrote, "He demonstrates genuine remorse, takes complete responsibility for his actions, and has developed coping mechanisms that suggest a sustainable recovery. His primary concern is not avoiding prison time, but ensuring Emma's welfare and healing." Mark's transformation was evident during his weekly phone calls with his mother, Susan Wilson, a retired nurse from Flagstaff who had watched her son's descent into addiction with helpless horror. For the first time in 5 years, Mark sounded like her son again, clear-minded, articulate, and devastated by the consequences of his choices. "I dream about her every night," Mark told his mother during one recorded call that would later be played in court. "I see her under that table, scared and hungry, and I know I did that to her. I know I chose drugs over my baby girl. How do you live with something like that, Ma? How do you forgive yourself for destroying the most precious thing in your life?" Susan Wilson had mortgaged her house to hire the best defense attorney she could afford. Richard Hawkins, a former prosecutor turned defense advocate who specialized in addiction-related cases. Hawkins understood that Mark's best chance for redemption lay not in denying his guilt, but in demonstrating his genuine transformation and commitment to making amends. Lisa Wilson's situation remained more complex and controversial. Her attorney, Michael Torres, had uncovered a pattern of domestic violence that painted her as a victim trapped in an impossible situation. Hospital records showed 3 emergency room visits in the months leading up to Emma's discovery, each with injuries consistent with physical abuse. Neighbors confirmed hearing violent arguments, and Lisa's supervisor at Denny's reported that she'd frequently come to work with unexplained bruises. But the prosecution had their own evidence that complicated the victim narrative. Security footage from a nearby convenience store showed Lisa purchasing alcohol and cigarettes 3 blocks from her apartment on the Friday, after she'd left Emma alone with Mark. She'd been in the area, knew Mark was using heavily, and had chosen not to check on her daughter. She had options, Prosecutor James Chun argued during a pretrial hearing. Women's shelters, family services, police protection. She could have taken Emma with her when she left. Instead, she made a series of choices that prioritized her own. Immediate safety over her child's welfare. Torres countered with expert testimony about the psychology of domestic abuse victims. Lisa Wilson was a battered woman, operating in survival mode, he argued. After years of violence and threats, her decision-making was compromised by trauma. She believed Mark's threats that he would hunt her down and kill both her and Emma if she tried to leave with the child. Her temporary abandonment was an act of desperation, not neglect. The case had attracted the attention of advocacy groups on both sides. The National Coalition Against Domestic Violence issued statements supporting Lisa, arguing that prosecuting abuse victims for actions taken under duress would discourage other women from seeking help. Child welfare organizations countered that nothing justified leaving a 3-year-old alone with an active drug addict, regardless of the circumstances. Emma, oblivious to the media storm and legal arguments swirling around her case, continued her slow healing process with the Rodriguez family. Carlos Rodriguez, a retired high school principal, had become particularly skilled at helping Emma process her trauma through play therapy. Elena Rodriguez, a former elementary school teacher, provided the maternal stability Emma desperately needed. But it was their weekly visits to see Detective Martinez and Rex that marked the most significant progress in Emma's recovery. During these sessions, she would spend hours drawing pictures, playing simple games, and gradually sharing memories from her time in apartment 4B. Dr. Foster documented each interaction, building a comprehensive record of Emma's psychological state and her unique relationship with Rex. Emma's attachment to Rex transcends typical child-animal bonds, Dr. Foster wrote in her latest evaluation. The dog represents safety, rescue, and hope in her trauma narrative. When she's with Rex, her anxiety decreases, her speech patterns normalize, and she demonstrates age-appropriate behavior. More importantly, she's willing to discuss traumatic memories only in Rex's presence. Judge Patricia Holbrook had scheduled a hearing for the following week to determine whether Rex would be permitted in the courtroom during Emma's testimony. Legal scholars from across the country had requested permission to observe, understanding that the decision could establish precedent for similar cases nationwide. The stakes had never been higher. Emma's future, her parents' freedom, and potentially the rights of countless other child victims hung in the balance. And at the center of it all was the unlikely bond between a traumatized 3-year-old and a German shepherd who'd become her bridge back to trust and communication. The courtroom battle was about to begin. But for Emma Wilson, the real fight for healing and justice had been taking place one quiet conversation with Rex at a time. The morning of Emma's testimony dawned crisp and clear, with Arizona's winter sun casting long shadows across the steps of the Maricopa County Superior Court. By 7 a.m., 3 hours before proceedings were scheduled to begin, a crowd had gathered that resembled a cross between a media circus and a protest rally. Reporters from major networks jockeyed for position with local news crews, while child advocacy groups held signs reading, "Let Emma speak," and "Justice for our babies." Detective Martinez arrived early, Rex walking calmly beside her through the chaos. The German shepherd wore his official police vest, but Dr. Foster had also fitted him with a special blue collar that identified him as a certified therapy animal, a designation he'd earned through intensive training over the past month. Irony wasn't lost on Martinez that her narcotics detection dog had become the most famous therapy animal in America, almost overnight. Inside the courthouse, security was unprecedented. Judge Patricia Holbrook had ordered the courtroom sealed to all but essential personnel, family members, and a small pool of journalists representing major news outlets. The gallery, which normally held over 100 spectators, had been limited to 30 people to minimize Emma's anxiety. Emma arrived at 9:30 a.m. in a van with tinted windows, accompanied by Elena Rodriguez, who had become her primary attachment figure over the past 7 months. The 3-year-old wore a pale blue dress that Elena had sewn specifically for this day, with small embroidered flowers that reminded Emma of the garden at the Rodriguez home. In her arms, she clutched the same battered stuffed bunny that had comforted her during those terrifying nights in apartment 4B. Dr. Foster had spent weeks preparing Emma for this moment through play therapy sessions that gradually introduced courthouse-like settings. They'd practiced with a makeshift witness stand made from blocks, used dolls to represent the judge and lawyers, and most importantly, rehearsed having Rex nearby during conversations about the bad time when Daddy was sleeping. But nothing could fully prepare a 3-year-old for the reality of a courtroom packed with strangers, all watching her with intense interest. The moment Emma entered the courtroom, her steps faltered. The high ceilings, formal atmosphere, and sea of adult faces triggered immediate anxiety. She pressed herself against Elena's leg and began the rhythmic humming that Dr. Foster had identified as a self-soothing mechanism. Mark Wilson sat at the defendant's table, wearing a navy blue suit that his mother had brought from home. Clean-shaven and 30 pounds heavier than his arrest photo, he looked like a completely different person. When Emma entered, his composure crumbled. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered to his attorney, "Look what I did to her. Look how scared she is." Lisa Wilson's reaction was equally emotional, but more complex. She half rose from her seat, one hand reaching toward her daughter before her attorney pulled her back down. Lisa had lost significant weight during the legal proceedings, and her face bore the gaunt look of someone surviving on stress and hope. She'd written dozens of letters to Emma that Dr. Foster had deemed inappropriate to deliver, each one pleading for forgiveness and promising a better future. Judge Holbrook, a 58-year-old mother of 3 grown children, had presided over family court for 15 years. She'd seen every variation of human dysfunction and resilience, but Emma Wilson's case had challenged every assumption she'd made about justice and child welfare. As she watched the tiny girl cling to Elena Rodriguez, Holbrook felt the weight of legal precedent pressing against her desire to protect an innocent victim. "Before we begin," Judge Holbrook announced, "I want to address the unprecedented nature of these proceedings. This court has determined that the unique circumstances of this case warrant accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The minor witness has demonstrated severe trauma-related communication disorders that prevent standard testimony procedures. Therefore, I am allowing the presence of a certified therapy animal to facilitate the witness's ability to communicate effectively." Defense attorney Richard Hawkins immediately stood. "Your Honor, my client objects to this accommodation. The presence of a police dog creates an inherently prejudicial atmosphere that could influence the proceedings. We request that our objection be noted for the record." Michael Torres, representing Lisa Wilson, echoed the objection, but with less conviction. His client had specifically instructed him not to do anything that might further traumatize Emma, even if it hurt Lisa's legal position. Prosecutor James Chun responded with calm authority. "Your Honor, the state's position is that Emma Wilson has the same right to effective communication as any other witness. The therapy animal accommodation doesn't change the facts of the case. It simply allows a trauma victim to share those facts in a manner that doesn't cause additional psychological harm. Dr. Foster had positioned herself in the gallery where Emma could see her, ready to intervene if the child showed signs of severe distress. As a signal to Emma that everything was proceeding according to plan, Dr. Foster held up a small drawing that Emma had made the previous week, a picture of herself, Rex, and Elena standing together under a rainbow. The moment of truth arrived. When Detective Martinez entered the courtroom with Rex, a German Shepherd had been trained to ignore distractions and focus solely on Emma's needs. But even his professional demeanor couldn't completely mask his recognition of the tense atmosphere. His ears were alert, his posture protective, as his eyes immediately found Emma across the room. Emma's transformation was immediate and dramatic. Her humming stopped, her grip on Alana's hand relaxed, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, she lifted her head to look around. When she spotted Rex, her face lit up with the first genuine smile anyone had seen from her all morning. "Rex," she called out, her clear voice carrying across the silent courtroom. It was the first word she'd spoken since arriving at the courthouse, and its impact was electric. Several jurors visibly relaxed. Mark Wilson's attorney placed a restraining hand on his client's shoulder as Mark seemed ready to collapse, and Judge Holbrook felt a flicker of hope that they might actually be able to help this child find her. Voice. Dr. Foster approached Emma slowly, kneeling to her eye level. "Emma, do you remember what we practiced? Rex is going to sit right next to you while you talk to the nice judge. You can pet him any time you want, and if you get scared, you can whisper to him just like we do at home." As Emma nodded solemnly, the courtroom held its collective breath. They were about to witness something that had never happened before. In now, American jurisprudence, a 3-year-old trauma victim, giving testimony to a police dog who had become her lifeline to communication and trust. The stakes couldn't be higher, and everyone in that courtroom understood they were making history. One small word at a time. The child-sized witness chair had been specially constructed for Emma's testimony, positioned at the same height as the judge's bench so she wouldn't feel overwhelmed by towering adults. Rex lay beside the chair, his brown eyes never leaving Emma's face as Dr. Foster helped the little girl climb up. Emma's legs dangled several inches from the floor, making her appear even smaller in the formal courtroom setting. Judge Holbrook leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but clear. "Emma, my name is Judge Holbrook. I'm like a teacher who helps people solve problems. Do you understand that everyone here wants to keep you safe?" Emma nodded once, her thumb finding its way to her mouth, a habit she'd developed since the trauma. Her free hand immediately reached down to touch Rex's head, drawing comfort from his warm presence. Prosecutor James Chun approached slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He'd practiced this moment dozens of times with Dr. Foster, learning to speak in the simple, direct language the 3-year-olds could understand. The entire case hinged on the next few minutes, and Chun felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on his shoulders like a physical force. "Emma, I'm Mr. Chun. I help make sure children are safe. Can you tell me about your house? The place where you lived with Mommy and Daddy?" Emma's eyes darted around the courtroom, taking in the sea of adult faces all focused intently on her. The attention was overwhelming, causing her to shrink back in the chair. She began rocking slightly, a self-soothing behavior that Dr. Foster had documented as a trauma response. "The house was scary," Emma whispered, so quietly that the court reporter had to lean forward to catch her words. "What made it scary?" Chun asked gently. Emma's rocking intensified, and she pressed her face against her stuffed bunny. The silence stretched for nearly a minute as everyone in the courtroom waited. Mark Wilson gripped his attorney's arm. "So, tightly that Richard Hawkins had to whisper for him to relax. Lisa Wilson held a tissue to her mouth, stifling sobs that threatened to escape. There were bad smells, Emma finally said. And Daddy would fall down and not get up. The simplicity of her words struck the courtroom like a physical blow. Here was a 3-year-old trying to explain the incomprehensible, that her father's drug use had created an environment where unconsciousness was normal and terror was a daily experience. Chun continued carefully. Emma, do you remember the last time you were in that house? Before the police came? This question triggered the response that Dr. Foster had been dreading. Emma's breathing became rapid and shallow. Her eyes grew wide with remembered fear, and she began shaking her head violently. No, she repeated, climbing down from the chair and trying to hide behind Rex. The courtroom fell into complete silence as everyone watched a 3-year-old relive her worst nightmare in real time. Judge Holbrook was prepared to call a recess when something extraordinary happened. Rex, responding to Emma's distress with the intuition that had made him an exceptional police dog, began to whimper softly. It wasn't the sound of a trained animal following commands. It was the gentle, comforting noise that a mother dog might make to soothe a frightened puppy. Rex lowered his head until he was at Emma's eye level, and his tail began a slow, rhythmic wagging that seemed to calm her breathing. Dr. Foster had documented this behavior before, but seeing it happen in the formal courtroom setting was mesmerizing. Rex seemed to understand instinctively that Emma needed him to be more than a therapy animal. She needed him to be her translator, her bridge back to communication. Emma wrapped her small arms around Rex's neck and pressed her face into his. For a moment, it seemed like the testimony might end there, with a traumatized child too overwhelmed to continue. But then, something magical happened. Still clinging to Rex, Emma began to speak. Not to the lawyers or the judge or the packed courtroom, but directly to the German shepherd who had become her lifeline to trust and safety. Rex, remember when Emma was so scared and so hungry? Her voice was small but clear, carrying across the silent courtroom with devastating clarity. Daddy fell down on the couch and wouldn't wake up, even when Emma shook him. Emma was really scared, because Daddy's eyes were open, but he couldn't see Emma. The court reporter's fingers flew across her stenotype machine, capturing every word as Emma continued her conversation with Rex. Mark Wilson collapsed forward onto the defendant's table, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs as he heard his daughter describe his overdose from her 3-year-old perspective. And Mommy was crying and throwing things, Emma continued, her words muffled by Rex's fur, but still audible to the courtroom's stunned silence. Mommy said bad words, and then she went away. Emma waited and waited for Mommy to come back, but she didn't come back. Lisa Wilson stood up abruptly, one hand reaching toward her daughter before her attorney pulled her back down. I'm sorry, baby, she whispered, her words barely audible but filled with anguish. Mommy is so sorry. Emma either didn't hear her mother's words or chose not to acknowledge them. She continued speaking to Rex, describing 3 days that no child should ever have to survive. Emma hid under the table because that's where it was safe. There was no food except old crackers, and the water from the sink tasted funny. Emma was so scared that the bad men would come back, the ones who made Daddy fall down. The reference to bad men caused Prosecutor Chun to exchange meaningful glances with Detective Martinez. Emma was describing drug dealers people a 3-year-old couldn't possibly understand, but had learned to fear through repeated exposure to dangerous situations. Emma got really hungry, Rex. Emma's tummy hurt so much, and Daddy still wouldn't wake up. Emma tried to cover Daddy with a blanket, but he was too big. The image of a 3-year-old trying to care for her unconscious father hit the courtroom like an emotional tsunami. Several jurors were openly crying, and even the usually stoic Judge Holbrook had to pause to compose herself. "But then you came, Rex," Emma said, her voice brightening for the first time during her testimony. "You found Emma under the table. And you weren't scary like the other people. You lay down with Emma and made her feel safe." As Emma continued talking to Rex, describing her rescue and the terrifying days that preceded it, everyone in the courtroom understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't just testimony. It was a 3-year-old's attempt to make sense of trauma through the only relationship that felt completely safe and trustworthy. The courtroom remained absolutely silent, hanging on every word from the little girl, who had found her voice by speaking to a dog who understood her pain better than any human ever could. The aftermath of Emma's testimony left the courtroom in a profound silence that seemed to echo with the weight of her innocent words. Judge Patricia Holbrook called for a 30-minute recess, but the emotional impact of what they'd witnessed would linger for months in the hearts and minds of everyone present. As court officers gently escorted Emma out through a side door, she looked back once at Rex, waving her small hand as if saying goodbye to her dearest friend. In the judges' chambers, Holbrook sat alone for the first time in hours, staring at her hands as they trembled slightly from the emotional intensity of Emma's testimony. In 30 years of legal practice and 15 years on the family court bench, she had never experienced anything that compared to watching a 3-year-old describe 3 days of terror and abandonment to a police dog who had become her translator of trauma. When court reconvened, the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. Mark Wilson's defense attorney, Richard Hawkins, stood first to address the court, his usual courtroom confidence replaced by something approaching reverence for what they'd all witnessed. "Your Honor," Hawkins began, his voice hoarse with emotion, "my client wishes to change his plea to guilty on all counts. After hearing his daughter's testimony, Mr. Wilson cannot in good conscience continue to fight charges that accurately reflect the harm he caused to the most important person in his world." Mark Wilson rose slowly, his legs unsteady as he faced Judge Holbrook. The transformation from the skeletal addict in the arrest photos to the clean, healthy man before the court was remarkable, but it was the devastation in his eyes that spoke most clearly about his internal journey. "Your Honor, I don't want to minimize what I did by calling it a disease or an addiction," Mark said, his voice breaking. "I made choices every single day that put drugs before my daughter's safety. I chose to bring dealers into our home. I chose to use while caring for a 3-year-old. I chose unconsciousness over consciousness when Emma needed me most." He paused, gathering strength to continue. "I heard my baby girl describe trying to cover me with a blanket while I was overdosing. I heard her talk about being hungry and scared and alone because of my choices. No punishment this court could impose would be worse than living with that knowledge for the rest of my life." Judge Holbrook listened intently as Mark continued. "I'm asking this court not for mercy, but for the opportunity to make amends through service. I want to complete my addiction recovery and spend my life helping other addicts understand what they're really risking when they choose drugs over their children. If Emma can ever forgive me, I want to be the father she deserved from the beginning." The sincerity in Mark's voice was unmistakable, but Judge Holbrook had heard countless defendants express remorse before sentencing. What made Mark Wilson different was the specific, detailed nature of his accountability and his focus on Emma's welfare rather than his own freedom. Lisa Wilson's case proved more complex and emotionally wrenching. Her attorney, Michael Torres, presented a compelling narrative of domestic violence, economic desperation, and impossible choices. Hospital records, police reports, and witness statements painted a picture of a woman trapped in an escalating cycle of abuse. Mrs. Wilson was a victim before she became a defendant, Torres argued. She lived in terror of Mark Wilson's violence and his threats against Emma. The night she left, she had suffered a broken rib and facial contusions. She believed, based on years of credible threats, that taking Emma would result in both their deaths. But prosecutor James Chun had evidence that complicated the victim narrative. Security footage showed Lisa in the neighborhood multiple times after leaving Emma alone, and her own sister testified that Lisa had called asking for money, but never mentioned leaving Emma with an unconscious addict. When Lisa took the stand in her own defense, the courtroom was unprepared for the raw anguish that poured out of her. She described years of escalating violence, threats against Emma's life, and a final confrontation where Mark had held a knife to her throat while promising to kill them both if she ever tried to leave with their daughter. "I thought he was unconscious from drinking," Lisa sobbed on the witness stand. "I didn't know about the heroin. I thought Emma would be safe for a few hours while I figured out how to get help. I was going to come back with the police, but I was so scared he would wake up and hurt her if he saw me." The contradiction in Lisa's testimony, her simultaneous knowledge and ignorance of Mark's condition, reflected the cognitive dissonance of someone who had survived by compartmentalizing reality. Dr. Foster, testifying as an expert witness, explained how domestic violence victims often develop coping mechanisms that impair their decision-making during crisis situations. Judge Holbrook spent 48 hours reviewing the case files, expert testimonies, and her own observations before rendering her decisions. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity when she returned to deliver the sentences that would determine Emma's future and establish legal precedent for similar cases nationwide. "Mr. Wilson," Judge Holbrook began, "your addiction does not excuse your choices, but your complete acceptance of responsibility and demonstrated commitment to recovery warrant consideration. I sentence you to 5 years in state prison, with the possibility of supervised release after 3 years, contingent upon continued sobriety and completion of advanced addiction counseling certification. Upon release, you will serve 5 years of supervised probation with monthly drug testing and will be permitted supervised visitation with Emma only after demonstrating 18 months of continuous sobriety." Mark Wilson nodded, tears streaming down his face as he accepted a sentence that felt both devastating and merciful. For Lisa Wilson, Judge Holbrook's decision reflected the complex intersection of victimization and accountability. "Mrs. Wilson, the court recognizes that you were a victim of domestic violence, but that status does not absolve you of responsibility for Emma's endangerment. You are sentenced to 2 years of supervised probation, mandatory domestic violence, counseling, parenting classes, and psychological evaluation. Your parental rights are suspended for 1 year, after which the court will review your progress toward reunification." The most crucial decision involved Emma's immediate custody. Judge Holbrook had spent considerable time evaluating the Rodriguez family's petition for temporary guardianship with the possibility of adoption if reunification efforts failed. Emma Wilson has demonstrated remarkable resilience and progress in the care of Carlos and Elena Rodriguez, Judge Holbrook announced. The court awards temporary guardianship to the Rodriguez family for a period of 18 months, during which supervised visits with both parents may occur as determined by Child Protective Services and Dr. Foster's ongoing evaluations. As the gavel fell, ending the most emotionally challenging case of her career, Judge Holbrook looked toward the gallery where Dr. Foster sat with Elena Rodriguez. Emma's future remained uncertain, but for the first time since that terrible night. In apartment 4B, she had a path forward built on safety, stability, and the unconditional love of people who understood that healing takes time. The courtroom slowly emptied, but the impact of Emma's courage would resonate far beyond those walls, changing how the legal system approached child testimony and trauma recovery for years to come. 18 months after that pivotal day in court, Emma Wilson sat cross-legged on the living room carpet of the Rodriguez home, carefully arranging colored blocks into a tower while humming a song Elena had taught her. The 4-year-old who had once survived on stale crackers and tap water now radiated the confidence and joy that came from consistent love, proper nutrition, and the security of knowing she was safe. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Emma's vocabulary had exploded from the whispered words she'd shared with Rex to full conversations, peppered with questions about everything from why the sky was blue to whether dogs dreamed about chasing cats. Her nightmares had gradually decreased, from nightly terrors to occasional dreams that Elena could soothe away with gentle words and warm hugs. "Mia, your daddy is here for his visit," Elena called softly from the kitchen, where she'd been preparing Mark Wilson's favorite cookies, a small gesture that spoke volumes about the Rodriguez family's capacity for forgiveness and hope. Mark appeared in the doorway, and the difference in him was as dramatic as Emma's transformation. Prison had been simultaneously the worst and best thing that had ever happened to him. The structured environment, mandatory therapy sessions, and complete absence of drugs had allowed him to confront the full reality of his addiction and its devastating impact on his daughter. He'd earned his GED behind bars, completed advanced addiction counseling certification, and become a peer mentor for other inmates struggling with substance abuse. More importantly, he'd learned to separate his love for Emma from his guilt about hurting her, understanding that his recovery had to be about becoming the father she deserved, not about absolving himself of past failures. "Hi, baby girl," Mark said quietly, settling onto the carpet at a respectful distance. The court-mandated supervision visits had taught him to follow Emma's lead, letting her control the pace and nature of their interactions. Emma looked up from her blocks, studying her father with the serious expression she'd developed when processing complex emotions. After a moment, she held up a red block. "This one is for you, Daddy. Red is for being strong." These monthly visits had become a cornerstone of Emma's healing process. Dr. Foster had documented how Emma's relationship with her father was slowly evolving from fear-based memories to cautious affection. She could now spend 2 hours with Mark without distress, and recently had even asked if he remembered her stuffed bunny from the scary house. The visits with Lisa Wilson remained more complicated and emotionally fraught. Lisa had completed her court-mandated programs: domestic violence counseling, parenting classes, and psychological evaluation, but her relationship with Emma remained strained by the fundamental truth that mothers aren't supposed to leave their children, even under impossible circumstances. "Emma still asks why Mommy went away," Elena had confided to Dr. Foster during their weekly sessions. "She understands that Daddy was sick, but she can't understand why being scared meant Mommy couldn't take her too." The court review that would determine Emma's permanent custody was scheduled for the following month, and all parties understood the stakes. Mark had demonstrated remarkable progress, but faced the reality that his choices had consequences that extended beyond his own rehabilitation. Lisa had worked tirelessly to rebuild her life, securing stable employment and housing, but struggled with Emma's emotional distance and her own guilt about those 3 crucial days. The Rodriguez family had made their position clear. They wanted to adopt Emma while maintaining supervised contact with both biological parents. Carlos and Elena, now in their late 50s, had discovered that raising Emma had given their own lives new purpose and meaning. Their adult children, Miguel and Sofia, had embraced Emma as their little sister, creating an extended family network that provided stability and love. A most remarkable development had come from an unexpected source: the Phoenix Police Department's new trauma response K9 program. Detective Martinez and Rex had become pioneers in using specially trained police dogs to help child victims communicate during investigations and court proceedings. Emma's case had sparked nationwide interest, leading to federal funding for similar programs in major cities across the country. Rex, now officially certified as both a narcotics detection dog and a trauma therapy animal, had become something of a celebrity in law enforcement circles. But more importantly, he'd helped 12 other children find their voices in situations involving abuse, neglect, and violence. Emma's courage in speaking to Rex had created a ripple effect that was protecting vulnerable children she would never meet. Detective Martinez says Rex talks about Emma at work. Dr. Foster told Elena during one of their sessions. He gets excited whenever her name is mentioned, like he remembers their special bond. Emma's weekly visits to the police station, too. See, Rex had become a highlight that she anticipated with pure joy. She would bring him drawings, share stories about preschool, and sometimes just sit quietly beside him while he worked. These visits served multiple therapeutic purposes. They maintained the relationship that had been crucial to her initial healing, reinforced positive associations with law enforcement, and provided Emma with a sense of contributing to something important. On this particular afternoon, as Mark helped Emma build a tower tall enough to reach the ceiling, Elena received a phone call that would change everything. Dr. Foster was calling with news from the preliminary custody review. The court has made its decision, Dr. Foster said, her voice carrying both excitement and emotion. Judge Holbrook is awarding permanent custody to you and Carlos, with the option for Emma to maintain supervised visitation with both parents as long as it serves her best interests. Elena wiped tears from her eyes as she watched Mark and Emma work together on their impossible tower, each block representing another step toward healing and hope. Mark had known this decision was coming and had spent months preparing Emma for the reality that the Rodriguez family would become her permanent home. Emma, Mark said gently, you know how you have a forever family now with Papa Carlos and Mama Elena? Emma nodded solemnly. And I still get to see you and Rex and Mommy. Sometimes, yes, baby girl. You get to keep everyone who loves you. As the sun set over Phoenix, casting golden light through the Rodriguez home's windows, Emma Wilson was no longer a victim of circumstances beyond her control. She was a beloved daughter, a proud big sister to her stuffed animals, a friend to a famous police dog, and a symbol of resilience for countless children facing their own impossible situations. Her story had begun in darkness and terror, but it was continuing in light and love, proof that sometimes the most broken things can be made beautiful again, one careful piece at a time.